Thank you. It is good to be with you. The book of Ecclesiastes says, of course, that there is nothing new under the sun. And it is sometimes said, and I myself like to say, that that very much applies to the history of ideas that the church encounters. Because the church has seen everything before. There's nothing new under the sun when it comes to new heresies or new ideas that the church has to deal with. But when I make that claim that the church has seen everything before, some of you may be thinking that can't be right in this case. The stuff that we're seeing in the broader culture today, the gender confusion and all of those kinds of things, surely the church has not seen anything like that before. Surely that is really something new under the sun. Short answer, no, it isn't. And yes, the church has seen things very much like this before. And so as we think about the anthropological challenges that the church is facing today, Greg wanted me to talk to you about ancient Gnosticism and about the resurgence of Gnosticism in the 20th and the 21st centuries. And so I'd like to do that this afternoon as a way of showing us that the ideas that sort of undergird what we're seeing in the culture around us today are ideas that actually have a very long history in human intellectual history. These are not new ideas at all. What is new is the technological and medical ability to act on them. But the ideas themselves are not new at all. And so I want to talk today, following the handout, about 4 major ways in which I see striking similarities between the ancient Gnosticism that the church faced in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries and the resurgence of Gnosticism in the 20th and 21st centuries. So that's what's on the handout. And then after that, I will talk about some of the ways that the church responded to Gnosticism to give us some suggestions as we seek to respond to the new Gnosticism today. So that's what's on the handout. That will be the main thing that I'll talk about. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of background to why Gnosticism and Gnostic type ideas are so influential and so much in vogue today. So I'd like to go back, not to the 2nd century yet, but to around the year 1945. And at this time, a couple of years before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, a group of codices was found in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, the Nag Hammadi codices. And these Nag Hammadi manuscripts were from Gnostic sources that had been evidently hidden, buried away, rather poorly preserved. And these Nag Hammadi manuscripts, scholars said, revolutionize our understanding of early Christianity. Now, one thing you need to recognize is that whenever there is a new find, the scholars play it up, and the news magazines and the podcasts and the web pages play it up, and everybody sensationalizes everything. In my opinion, the only 20th century manuscript find that really lived up to the hype was the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is not true that the Nag Hammadi discoveries actually revolutionized our understanding even of Gnosticism, let alone of early Christianity. In my opinion, what they did was to show us that Irenaeus in the 2nd century had understood Gnosticism very, very well. They basically confirmed the way Irenaeus, speaking for the church in the 2nd century, had described Gnosticism. So if that's the case, why the scholarly hoopla? Why the hype? What I would like to suggest is that the trend of Western academic thinking in the middle of the 20th century was a trend toward a fairly thorough rejection of most of the aspects of traditional Christianity. And that's no surprise when I say that. But there also seems to have been, on the part of scholars, an unusual attempt to hang on to the name Christian, which I think is odd. I think it's odd that these people still wanted to think of themselves as Christians, even though they were very much opposed to historic Christian orthodoxy. What Nag Hammadi enabled them to do, or they claimed it enabled them to do, was to say, in the early church, there were many different kinds of Christianity. There was not a single kind of Orthodox Christianity, but there were different kinds. And those different kinds of Christianity, those different Christianities in the plural, relied on different scriptures, some of which we have just uncovered in Nag Hammadi. So you have one group of Christians over here relying on what we call the Bible and leading to what we call historic Christian orthodoxy. And you have other groups of Christians over here, and they are relying on different scriptures and coming to different conclusions about God and about humanity and about salvation. And here's the important point. Obviously, none of them are any better or worse than the others. And it's purely arbitrary that this one won out and became historic Christian orthodoxy. So Nag Hammadi has been used by modern scholars. These discoveries of Gnostic writings have been used by modern scholars to argue that there are many different kinds of Christianities, and we shouldn't privilege historic orthodoxy based on what we call the Bible. So, for example, Bart Ehrman says rather flippantly, some Christians believe there was one God. Some believe there were two. Some believe there were 30 or 365. And he writes that very flippantly. And he says, and whenever somebody asks him, do you believe the Bible? He claims to say, whose Bible? The Bible that historic Christian orthodoxy calls the Bible, or some of these documents from the Nag Hammadi library, which belong to different groups of Gnostics and which he claims constituted scripture for those different groups of Gnostics. So over the last 50, 75 years or so, the scholars have been emphasizing many Christianities, none better or worse. We like this one because it doesn't require us to speak of sin or a cross or resurrection and tie salvation to those things. Here's another pathway to God that we like better, and we can still call this Christian. And we can say it's completely arbitrary that this one won out rather than this one. Now, short story, that is not remotely true. That is not remotely true. Gnosticism, as a set of ideas, predates Christianity. So-called Christian Gnosticism uses Christian terminology, but it's really something very different. And the church has never regarded it as being Christian. And, as I've just said, Irenaeus, the major respondent to Gnosticism, writing about the year 180, the late 2nd century, actually understood Gnosticism extremely well, as shown by the fact that even Bart Ehrman, when he says that these scriptures revolutionize everything, and yet when it actually comes to describing Gnosticism in his books, not only does he take his description from Irenaeus, he even says he's taken it from Irenaeus. These findings have not revolutionized anything because Irenaeus understood Gnosticism very well, and because the early church understood Gnosticism very well and responded to it in ways that I think are very appropriate and that I will talk about later this afternoon. So with all of that as a little bit of background to what's going on in the way the modern scholars are presenting, sensationalistically presenting Gnosticism, let's turn to the handout and to the 4 striking similarities that I find between ancient Gnosticism and the resurgence of Gnosticism in the modern period. So, first striking similarity, letter A on the handout. The physical is of no consequence for one's identity. The physical is of no consequence for one's identity. I'm sorry, before I do that, there's one other thing that I wanted to do before I got to that. So if you'll permit me to backtrack for just a second with apologies, let me do one more thing. Let me give you a little bit of an overview of the basic ideas of Gnosticism. In Gnosticism, you have a high God, the highest God, impersonal, unapproachable, beyond our ability to comprehend it. And then you have various levels of spirituality which work their way down from this high God. And those are called eons. One famous version of Gnosticism has 30 of those. Another one has 365. That is what Bart Ehrman is talking about when he says that some Christians believed in 30 gods and some believed in 365 gods. At the bottom of this set of emanations from the one God, these levels of spirituality, is an evil God. And that evil God is the one who created the physical universe. And therefore the physical universe is bad, it is evil, it is created by the evil God. In some forms of Gnosticism, it is said that God is the God of the Old Testament, as in Marcionism, for example. So, high God, unapproachable. Various different levels of spirituality, low God, bad God, who created the physical world, which is therefore evil. But a representative of the high God, called the Logos, communicates to another representative of the high God, called Sophia, or wisdom, who sneaks into each person an immaterial element, soul or mind or spirit, rational soul, something like that, which is created ultimately by a representative of the good God, and which is distinct from the body which is evil. So in Gnosticism, salvation consists of the escape of the immaterial component from the body. And that escape has to be engineered by the soul itself. The soul has to actualize itself to escape from the body in order to be reunited to the spiritual realm from which it came in, ultimately to the high God. So that's the basic idea of Gnosticism. So now let me go to letter A on the handout. Striking similarities between ancient Gnosticism and contemporary West. Letter A, the physical is of no consequence in one's identity. Let's look at a couple of brief passages here. From a book called The Revelation of Adam in the early 2nd century, we resembled the great eternal angels, for we were superior to the God who had created us, and the powers with him whom we did not know. Okay, we is talking about the souls, the immaterial components. Not only are the souls better than the bodies, the souls are better than the God who created the bodies. So you've got a cosmos here in which the human soul is higher than one of the gods. The immaterial is good, the physical is evil. Our souls are better than the God who created our physical bodies. Another quotation from the Tripartite Tractate in the early 3rd century. We must therefore conclude that the soul of the first human derives from the spiritual word, the Logos, even if the Creator thought it was his. Okay, Creator, that's the bad God who created the physical universe, who's also the one who created the human body. That God thinks that he or it owns the person, the human being. But he doesn't, or it doesn't, because the spiritual element within us belongs to the Word, belongs to the Logos. Okay, so these are a couple of quotations related to 2nd and 3rd century Gnosticism. But notice the similarities to what is going on today. We don't typically express this in terms of good and evil. We rarely express this in terms of creation by one God or being made by another God. But the idea that our physical bodies, which are male or female, have nothing to do with the reality of who we are is a very common idea. In a sense, we believe that we are the product of a reality higher than whatever processes produced our physical body. The I, the me, the identity of who I am, the heart and soul of who I am, has nothing to do with the fact that I have a male body. It has nothing to do with the process by which that body came to be and the fact that I have parents, etc., etc. My ultimate identity is something higher than that, something separable from that, something that I want to separate from that. This is expressed today in terms that don't have anything to do with gods, but it is a spirituality nevertheless. It is a spirituality almost in the literal sense because it exalts the spirit rather than the physical. So this is a fairly common, I think, a fairly straightforward correspondence between ancient Gnosticism and contemporary Gnosticism. So let's look at the second one, letter B. The universe revolves around one's self-actualization. The divine is within a person. Okay, once again, the physical body is evil, created by the evil God. The spiritual element or immaterial element within a person is that person's identity. And that must actualize itself, which means that salvation comes from within me, not from without, not from the outside. From the secret book of James in the late 2nd century, blessed is one who has seen oneself as a fourth one in heaven. Now notice here that this is obviously jumping off from a Christian notion of the Trinity. By saying that my inner self will see myself as a fourth one in heaven is obviously referring to there are three others in heaven. There are three persons of the Trinity that the Christians call Father, Son, and Spirit. I am like them. I see myself as being on a par with them. Now, to back up a little bit here, in the ancient world of the Mediterranean, the dominant philosophy was Platonism. Today we break it up into Platonism, Middle Platonism, and Neoplatonism. But in Platonism, there was the idea that you have a high God, and then you have a lower God, and then you have a lower God. And they're all manifestations of the same kind of spiritual reality. But the second one is called the Logos. And the third one is sometimes called the Spirit. So in that philosophy around the church, there is a Trinitarian approach to God. But it is an unequal Trinity. The high God and the Logos is lower, and the Spirit is lower. That unequal Trinity is lying behind what the Gnostics are saying here. And they are understood unequally, but I can become equal to them. My soul can unite with the low one, like the bottom rung on a ladder, then can unite with the middle one, the Logos, another rung on the ladder, then can unite with the high one at the top of the ladder. So there's the idea that I can become equal to God. This is nothing like Christianity, but it is based on an idea in which you can speak of God, Logos, Spirit. It sounds Christian. And so you can speak of 3, and then you can speak of yourself as another one, so you can speak of 4 in heaven. Another quotation from the Gospel of Thomas, which is the most famous of the Gnostic Gospels. Before I read the quote, let me say just a little bit about this. In the middle of the 20th century, in the latter part of the 20th century, many scholars were trying to say that the Gospel of Thomas was written as early as the 60s AD. And this was part of a program to discredit the canonical Gospels by saying they were written in the 2nd century, and to exalt the Gospel of Thomas by saying it was written earlier than all of them, as early as 60 AD, and therefore it is more reliable. The dating of ancient books involves figuring things out from a lot of different clues. There's a fair bit of wiggle room for one's biases to sneak into the way one dates things. But it was very common for the scholars to discredit the canonical Gospels by putting them late, and to exalt the alleged reliability of the Gospel of Thomas by putting it early. Many of you know Nick Perrin, a friend of mine who has been president of TEDS. Nick Perrin did his PhD work on the date of the Gospel of Thomas, and he showed quite convincingly that the Gospel of Thomas was written in the late 2nd century, that it was more wishful thinking than anything else to say that the Gospel of Thomas was written as early as the 60s. To Nick Perrin's very good work on that subject, let me simply add, Irenaeus, writing in the year 180, describes every kind of Gnosticism under the sun, but he doesn't mention the Gospel of Thomas. Why not? Probably because it hadn't been written yet. So the Gospel of Thomas was probably written in the late 2nd century, in spite of its celebrity among scholars who try to place it much earlier. So from the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have within you will kill you." Okay, so notice here that salvation comes from within oneself. It does not come from the outside. One part of each human being is unredeemable and evil. Another part is divine and is able to escape and actualize itself and be reunited to the spiritual realm. Very, very common throughout most of Gnosticism. Now, notice the similarity between that and the kind of thing that we see today. We don't normally express this in terms of gods today, but we do express it in terms of spirituality. There's a self-focus that pervades society today. There's a focus on my truth, which is essentially Gnostic. Within me, the spiritual element within me is what produces my truth. Whatever I say my truth is, I have the privilege of living that way. In fact, lately we have begun to say, whatever my truth is, not only do I get to live in the light of that, you have to live in the light of that as well, even if my perception of my identity changes from day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. I get to live by my truth. My self-actualization is within me. But even more dramatically, you have to live by that as well. So again, I think there's a similarity between this aspect of self-salvation in ancient Gnosticism and in a non-theistic kind of way, the focus on self-actualization in modern Gnosticism. Now, a third similarity, letter C on the handout. Severe sexual and gender confusion. Let me read again from the Gospel of Thomas. When you make male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, nor the female be female, then you will enter the kingdom. Okay, so notice here that in the Gospel of Thomas, the ideal for humanity entering the kingdom is neither male nor female. Why? Why? Well, partly because the reality, the divine spark within each person, is immaterial. Our maleness and our femaleness are products of our physicality. If you denigrate the significance of that physicality, if you say that that's what you're trying to escape, then the you who escapes can be neither male nor female, but simply an undifferentiated spirituality. So we see this erasure of maleness and femaleness in a lot of second century Gnosticism. Let me say as a bit of background here that in much of the ancient world, especially in Asia and particularly in India, there for millennia has been a fascination with androgyny. And so the idea of divine beings or spirits that are both male and female was very common. And in art, there was the attempt to depict gods or goddesses, actually, I need a third word, divine things that are either neither male nor female or both male and female and actually have both male and female genitalia. So there's a lot of that kind of ideal in the ancient world. And from Asia, that works its way into the Mediterranean world in the centuries before the Christian era and begins to appear in Gnosticism in the first and especially the second and the third centuries. Another quote from the three forms of first thought from the second century, and I apologize for even reading this out loud, but let me do so. I am androgynous. I am mother and I am father, since I mate with myself. I mate with myself, since it is myself that I love. Here, the focus on self-love is expressed in crudely sexual terms. And again, I apologize even for reading this. But notice that there's a really intense irony here in Gnosticism. You've got a worldview that says the physical has nothing to do with anything, and the spiritual is what matters. And yet, this worldview is utterly obsessed with sex and wants to think of sex in ways that obliterate male-female distinctions. But nevertheless, in spite of being very anti-physical, it is nevertheless very obsessed with sex. And as we turn to the contemporary situation, we see very much the same thing. We see the attempt to obliterate male-female differences. We see the attempt to regard those as insignificant, to divorce identity from the physical body, which is male or female. But at the same time, we see an attempt to divorce sex from maleness and femaleness. And in descriptions of sex, which I'm not going to read to you, they don't even talk about the man and the woman anymore. They talk about this in different ways now. So we see that attempt, and yet at the same time, sex seems to be extremely fundamental to identity, which does not make any sense if the physical has nothing to do with identity. So we see a surprisingly close parallel here between the way ancient Gnosticism and modern Gnosticism have confused gender, confused male and female, and yet remain very obsessively concerned with sex. So that one may be a big surprise. If you know much about Gnosticism, the first two similarities that I talked about are probably not that surprising. This third one may very well be a surprise. And I think the fourth one is perhaps going to be a surprise also. So let's look at the fourth similarity, letter D. I suggest that in ancient Gnosticism and in modern Gnosticism, being female is considered to be a sickness, a disease from which one needs to be cured. That is very, very clear in ancient Gnosticism. Let me read again from the Tripartite Tractate from the 3rd century. This passage is describing true Gnostics, and it says, being male forms, since they have not originated from sickness, which is femaleness, but from one who has already left the sickness behind, they possess the name church. Femaleness is a sickness. Maleness is good. Again, recognize that doesn't make any sense if you disavow the significance of the physical. But underneath this anti-physical veneer, there's a sense that being female is something from which you need to be cured. Another quote, even more dramatic, and this is probably the most famous quote from any of the Gnostic writings. This is the end of the Gospel of Thomas from the late 2nd century. Simon Peter said to them, Mary should leave us, for females are not worthy of life. Jesus said, look, I shall guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter heaven's kingdom. In Gnosticism, a female is not a different kind of human being from a male. A female is a being who has not succeeded in becoming human. And so part of Gnostic spirituality as it is offered to women is that somehow, in a non-physical way that is not described, by being a Gnostic initiate, you can become male and therefore enter the kingdom of heaven. Notice that there's a kind of a logic in saying what I said a few minutes ago, that you can transcend being male or female to unite them by being purely spiritual. Since the spiritual isn't physical and physicality is the origin of maleness and femaleness, so to speak, you can kind of think it makes sense to say, once you depart from the body, you're not male or female anymore. You can get your mind around that idea. But you can't get your mind around this. If the goal is to leave the body, then how does that constitute becoming male when you cease to be female? Arguably, this doesn't make any sense at all. What I suggest, though, is that there is a deep-seated misogyny, a deep-seated anti-female strain within Gnosticism. And it is surprising to me that great female scholars like Elaine Pagels in particular are so keen on the Gospel of Thomas and so keen on Gnosticism, given its very obvious anti-female strain. But they are. They are. Now, that's ancient Gnosticism. What about modern Gnosticism? I suggest that much the same kind of thing is happening here. There are some people that I read, not Christians, but secular writers, and especially secular feminist writers, who say that transgenderism is the worst kind of patrimony. If you say that a male who says he's a woman is a woman, then you're one step away from saying he should have the right to participate in women's sports, including boxing matches. If you say that a man who says he is a woman should have the right to be in female-only spaces, locker rooms, restrooms, female prisons, which is a big issue right now, etc., then that goes along with saying that the physical reality isn't real, that your identity is something besides your physical body, which is male or female. But underneath that obvious justification, that surface level justification, there is a deep-seated lack of concern for females, for femininity, for the need for female spaces, for the sense of fairness that allows women who haven't gone through male changes at puberty to be able to compete fairly with other women in sports, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are justified by an anti-Gnostic ideology, an anti-physical ideology. But there are a lot of people, not many of whom are Christians actually, there are a lot of secular people who are saying, this is misogyny, this is anti-female, this is the worst kind of patrimony. At heart, I would like to suggest that modern Gnosticism may be just as inherently anti-female as ancient Gnosticism was. But there's a catch here, and that is that modern Gnosticism is also anti-male. In the modern culture, it is sometimes argued that the only unforgivable sin is being male. I find it a bit humorous that college administrators are surprised today that so few 18-year-old boys want to go to college anymore. Well, if what they're going to be told in college is that the worst thing is to be male, no wonder they don't want to go to college. And there's an inherent anti-maleness in the culture as well as an inherent anti-femaleness. Now, the second of those didn't really exist in early Gnosticism. This is a development, a new development in more recent Gnosticism. But when you put together that anti-maleness and that anti-femaleness, what you are telling people is that to be good, to actualize yourself, to transcend the limits of your physicality, you've got to be whichever one you're not. If you're male, you've got to become female. If you're female, you've got to become male. In the same way that they used to say, if you're straight, you've got to become gay. The whole idea sort of revolves around an attempt to rebel against what has been regarded as normal. And in this case, what is normal in terms of physicality. So there's a striking parallel, an unexpected parallel, I suspect, here between ancient Gnosticism and modern Gnosticism. But I would say modern Gnosticism is going beyond in being, in many ways, just as anti-male as it is anti-female. So these are some what might be surprising ways in which ancient Gnosticism and our modern culture have similarities. What I would like to do now is to turn to the ways that the church responded to Gnosticism in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries to see if we can gain any insights from them. Let me do that, Roman numeral 2 here, by giving a summary of sin from Athanasius at the beginning of the 4th century and around the year 335. By the way, this has nothing to do with the Trinitarian controversy and the Creed of Nicaea. This is something else that Athanasius wrote on in another one of his works called Against the Pagans. But Athanasius defines sin as I summarize it. This is not word for word, but this is the way I summarize what Athanasius is saying. Sin is the imagining of a non-existent alternate reality, living as if that alternate reality were real, and worshiping that alternate reality instead of the living God. Athanasius is writing in the early 4th century in a Gnostic kind of thought world, and that is how he is defining sin. When I think about what he says there, when I read that and reread that, I am astonished at how prescient he was. If Athanasius could see us today, how much more today are we seeking to live in a non-existent reality as if it were real? How much more today are we worshiping that alternate reality instead of the living God? I think this may be one of the most important descriptions of sin that we find in Christian history. So, that's what Athanasius says in the 4th century. Let me go back to Irenaeus now. And Irenaeus, in his great work against heresies, at the end of the 2nd century, puts his finger on what he says is the source of the problems with Gnosticism. Basically, he says, you're interpreting the Bible wrong. But the way he says it is very important. Irenaeus says, imagine a mosaic put together from costly gemstones with a beautiful picture of a king. What the Gnostics are doing is taking the gemstones off of that mosaic and rearranging them to make a bad picture of a fox or a dog, and then saying, that's what the Bible is about. The Bible is not this beautiful picture of the king who has come down to the level of his servants in order to save us when we could not save ourselves, make us a part of his kingdom and a part of his family, sons and daughters of his Father. No, the Bible is about my crudely sexual self-actualization and saying that that's the divine within me. Notice Irenaeus is not saying you didn't use the rules of hermeneutics right. He's saying you got the big picture of what the Bible's about completely wrong. And because of that, you interpret the passages wrong individually as well. So Irenaeus is saying that the source of the Gnostics' problems is that they do not understand what the Bible's about. In our terms, they've got the wrong theology. They've deduced the wrong big picture theology from the Bible. What I would like to do now is to talk about the ancient church's response to Gnosticism. And the church responded to Gnosticism in a couple of ways. One is to focus on individual things that the Gnostics say that are wrong and unbiblical, and to correct those from the Bible. And that's fairly obvious. You would expect the church to do that. But the other thing that the church does in response to the Gnostics is to present a positive picture of the teaching of Scripture, emphasizing the concern of God for this world and for the physical. So they do not simply critique individual things the Gnostics say. They present in bold brushstrokes the big picture of the Bible. Irenaeus' great work against heresies has 5 books. The first book is a description of the various Gnostic systems and what they believe. The second book is a refutation of specific points that the Gnostics make. But books 3 through 5, well over half of the work, excuse me, books 3 through 5, well over half of the work, consist of a positive treatment of the Christian faith, emphasizing the reality and goodness of the physical world and the concern of God for the physical, and that God's ultimate purposes for humanity have to do with this physical world. That positive treatment is the first great such treatment of the Christian faith. It is arguably the first systematic theology in Christian history. But he presents this as a way of saying, this is the real picture, in contrast to the picture that you have tried to foist on the Bible. So, more specifically, how does Irenaeus do that, and how does the ancient church do that? They focus on one God, not a myriad of spiritual levels. And in particular, they emphasize that the God who created the Old Testament is the same God who sent his Son, Jesus Christ. You can't say one of those is evil and the other of those is good. One is low and the other is high. One God created everything. In fact, another person who responds to Gnosticism, Tertullian, has an even longer work in which most of the work is an attempt to show the unity of the Old and New Testament as a way of showing one God wrote both of them. So one God, not a myriad of spiritual levels. This God created everything else through his word and his spirit. If you were here yesterday morning, you heard me saying that quite often. We are meant to be physical, embodied, and thus either male or female, and so to be created male and female is good. Just as an illustration of this point that Irenaeus is making, C.S. Lewis once commented that the trouble with man is that he tries to be more spiritual than God. God is purely spiritual. So are angels, if you want to be picky. We are meant to be spiritual and physical. We are indeed the only creatures that are both spiritual and physical. We're meant to be that way. It is good to be that way. Irenaeus emphasizes this very strongly. So does C.S. Lewis much later. Each of us is who God made us to be. We do not have to face the burden of trying to construct an identity for ourselves. One of the things that I think we need to recognize about modern Gnosticism and the modern thought world around us is that it appears to be liberated to say that you can construct your own ability. But we need to recognize that that is profoundly burdensome. To have to say you are meaningless unless you can construct meaning for yourself is an extraordinary burden to place on a person, an extraordinary burden to place on a young person. And these are the ones on whom it often falls. That is burdensome. That is despair-inducing. That is depression-inducing. And it's no surprise that mental illness is so much on the rise in this kind of culture in which we live today. We are who God made us to be. We are who God says we are. Our identity comes from another who is good and all-powerful and concerned about us. And that includes our physical identity, whether we are male or female, whether we are pretty or not, whether we are tall enough to play whatever sport we want to play. You know, I used to want to be 7 feet tall so I could play basketball in the NBA. At my tallest, I might have scraped by at 5'11". I didn't understand genetics very well. Whatever we may not like about ourselves, the physicality with which God has endued us was given to us as a good by God. We do not face the burden of having to construct some sort of reality, some sort of identity, some sort of sense of value ourselves. Furthermore, of course, God's eternal Son himself has become human and physical to live, to die, to be raised as a man for us. And then finally, and obviously, our hope is in the resurrection of the body, not the ascent of the soul up some ladder that leads to some kind of God that we cannot know. Yesterday, you heard me say that at the end of history, God changes his own address, coming down to earth in order to dwell with his people in the new heavens and the new earth, here with us in our glorified and restored physical bodies. This is the way the church, especially the 2nd and the 3rd century church, painted a positive picture of Christianity's understanding of the physical and of God's concern for the physical in opposition to Gnosticism. But notice that even though the church painted that picture so clearly, a kind of crypto-Gnosticism has still worked its way into a lot of Christianity. The idea that the spiritual is better than the physical, even if the physical is not bad. the idea that ultimately what we're trying to do is to get to heaven, even the idea that our souls are naturally immortal, which is a Greek idea, not a biblical idea. The fact that our souls will live forever is a gift of God. It has nothing to do with any natural ability of the soul to avoid dying. That's a gift, just as it is a gift that God will resurrect our bodies. So there's a small level kind of crypto-Gnosticism that has disturbed Christianity all the way through its history, in spite of the way Irenaeus and others have so clearly laid out a positive Christian vision of the physical universe in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries. So that sort of crypto-Gnosticism is one thing that the church needs to counter. But the new Gnosticism, the new pagan Gnosticism, if you will, in our culture in the late 20th and the early 21st century is obviously a much bigger problem. So finally, let me suggest some things that we can do to try to get the big picture right today. There are probably cases where we need to say, that isn't the way God meant you to live. But we need to do more than just call out mistakes in the culture. We need to be able to paint, as Irenaeus and others did, the big picture of Christianity and the concern for the physical. So I suggest we need to emphasize the goodness of being physical. We need to emphasize the goodness of being female. The next point is going to be the goodness of being male. But let me pause for a minute on the goodness of being female. I fear that for much of Christian history, the Christian church has not valued femaleness. It has used femaleness, but not valued it. Not genuinely recognized and valued females as equals and the contributions that they make to the ministry, to the kingdom of God, to the family, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to me that part of what has led to secular feminism is a culture that is sent a signal to women, if you want to be important, you have to act like a man. If that's right or not, whether or not that's right about the secular culture, I wonder if the same kind of thing has happened in the church. And so I raised that question for us to consider. To fight Gnosticism today, we need to emphasize the goodness of being physical, the goodness of being female. We also need to emphasize the goodness of being male. And we need to recognize how strongly the surrounding culture is sending young men a signal that to be male is an unforgivable sin. That is very much out there. And we need to talk about the goodness of being male just as much as we talk about the goodness of being female. We need to emphasize that this world is the focus of God's concern. We need to emphasize, as I've just said, that heaven will be on this reconstituted earth, not up there, but ultimately here. God's last act in history will be to change his address, to dwell with his people in the New Jerusalem. So what I've tried to do here is to suggest some of the parallels between ancient and modern Gnosticism, and also to emphasize the importance of presenting to our people, and as we have opportunity to the world around us, a positive vision of the physical and God's concern for the physical as part of the way that we seek to counteract the insidious influence of modern Gnosticism.